morning. I'm Alan Bird again. We're going to dive right into the information that I promised you was going to either clear your doubts about the relaxer systems, also give you the tools that you will need in order to be properly educated and educate folks about the efficacy and the safety of relaxers. This is going to be a long, scientific, methodical presentation over the next 5 weeks. And it's important that you understand that, because in this day and age of social media, 90-second reels, people scrolling through so fast that you can't really understand what's going on. We're gonna have to fight the urge to not scroll away, because the only way this can truly be told is through detail, and that's how I had to find that information. My team and I had to slow down and go line by line by line in order to find the information that we knew should have been there or wasn't there. So when they say the devil's in the details, it has a lot of true meaning to it. So we had to go into details to find out what was going on. And through our research, what we found out that there are two ways for us to attack this, right? Either we could try to fight the social media onslaught, the public relations campaign that's out there currently. I know you all are seeing it. If you're on social media now, right about now, you're seeing relaxer lawsuit posts, you're seeing social media things, people saying, well, hey, sign up for this cancer relaxer lawsuit. All these things are out there. And believe you me, I've tried to respond to as many as I could. I've tried to call certain media outlets, but it was just overwhelming. But thankfully, we found a remedy. So in the military, we have different strategies that we use in order to attack the enemy. And one of the things is you got to cut off the head sometimes. Fortunately for us, there's an opportunity for us to attack the misinformation at its source. Because this is a government originated study, according to what they call the NIH study, we have an opportunity to redress that inconsistency. So what we decided to do was, off the bat, once we got our research done, to submit what's called a National NIH Information Quality Act petition. So what I'm going to do today is read the petition. We decided that will be our first point of attack, to directly petition the government with their inconsistencies and what we found. And from that point, we will further on with our exhibits A to Z that goes over every little thing that we found. So without further ado, let me start reading it and we'll go from there. Okay, so it says, submitted to the National Institutes of Health, submitted by Alan Bird, date October 25th, 2025. Legal foundation. This petition is filed pursuant to the Information Quality Act and the NIH's quality guidelines. The IQA requires federal agencies to ensure and maximize the quality, objectivity, utility, and integrity of information they disseminate. Where disseminated information is demonstrably false, misleading, or lacking scientific integrity, affected parties have the right to petition for correction. The NIH, through the National Institutes of Health Environmental Health Studies, published and promoted information concerning chemical hair straighteners and cancer risk. This dissemination lacking scientific integrity and misrepresenting study data has since been cited in litigation, regulatory debates, and widespread media coverage. It continues to cause economic and reputational harm, particularly to salon professionals, cosmetologists, distributors, and manufacturers of chemical hair relaxers. The importance of correcting these violations is underscored by recent scholarship on the problem of miscitation, Cobb and American psychologists, and disseminated on the NIH's own PubMed platform. Documented that nearly 1 in 5 citations in leading scientific journals misstate prior research findings, and approximately 1 in 10 completely mischaracterize results. The authors warn that such miscitation undermines the reliability and credibility of science, misleads subsequent research and policy, and erodes public trust in legitimate scientific inquiry. This acknowledgement, hosted on the NIH's own platform, underscores the urgency and legitimacy of correcting miscitation in the NIH's own disseminations. Section 1, information to be corrected. The NIH disseminated the following communications. NIH news release, December 4th, 2019, titled, Permanent Hair Dye and Straighteners May Increase Breast Cancer Risk. This communication publicly introduced the henceforth terminology that reclassified chemically distinct products under a single umbrella term, hair straighteners. The release failed to clarify that straighteners included formaldehyde-based keratin smoothing systems and alkaline hydroxide relaxers, two unrelated chemical processes with different toxicological and regulatory profiles. By collapsing these exposures, the NIH, the foundation for subsequent misclassification and confusion in later studies, including the 2021 ovarian and the 2022 uterine cancer papers. This dissemination therefore constitutes the earliest example of non-compliance with the IQA objectivity and utility standards. NIH web article, October 11, 2022. This is the one that started all the hullabaloo, this latest relaxer lawsuit that we're dealing with right now. Headline, frequent use of hair straightening chemicals may double the risk of uterine cancer and emphasize a 4% lifetime risk by age 70. While the article itself was peer-reviewed and published externally in the Journal of National Cancer Institute, NIH branded the findings as an NIH study and amplified the most dramatic hazard ratios without context. The doubling and 50% increase cited in this article came from the base model, which did not adjust for body mass index or physical activity. The published study later acknowledged that BMI estimates are unstable due to a small sample size and that physical activity data was removed from the model for non-scientific reasons. By applying industrial exposure logic to a rinse-off cosmetic product category, this communication reflected an underlying methodological flaw, treating short-duration cosmetic contact as if it were a chronic environmental exposure. This same flaw formed the basis of this regulatory gaps described later in this petition. By highlighting only the unadjusted figures in its headline while excluding these limitations, NIH selectively framed the study, overstating risk in its official communication. The NIH release, October 17th, 2022, titled, Hair Straightening Chemicals Associated with Higher Uterine Cancer Risk. The subheadline declared, in a new study from National Institutes of Health, the release repeated claims that hair straighteners have been known to contain formaldehyde and cited endocrine disruptor concerns from unrelated environmental or occupational studies, most of which were either found no detections of relaxers, detections limited to shampoos and conditioners and kits, or formaldehyde exposure specific to keratin smoothing treatments. The reliance on endocrine disruption models drawn from environmental toxicology rather than cosmetic toxicology illustrates the same methodological and regulatory ambiguity that will be detailed in Section 2. It also added metals as a chemical hazard, even though the underlying evidence only showed trace levels of non-US products and did not classify them as endocrine disruptors. The last two communications presented in the study as an NIH study, despite its own reference toxicology report showing ND and relaxers, which means not detected, repeated faulty claims of carcinogens and endocrine disruptors in chemical straighteners, and have been widely cited in multi-district litigation suing relaxer manufacturers only as an authoritative government science. So that is our section 1, which covers information to be corrected. So before we go forward to the second section, just want to, I guess, talk a little bit about, what each one of these news releases did and why we feel that we have legal standing to dispute the veracity and accuracy of these news releases. The first one in 2019, when they basically combined hair relaxers with formaldehyde smoothing systems. That was misleading because in their report, they literally said that prior studies only focus on relaxers, and that the reason that their studies and their findings were different was because they included formaldehyde and then decided to conflate them. And as you well know, relaxers and formaldehyde producing keratin treatments are totally different. So we're gonna go further than that. That's in one of the exhibits to where we break that particular incident down piece by piece. The second one being the two combined, the ones in October of 2022 that really started all this stuff. Basically, them continue to push this 50% doubling. It was out of context because the vast majority of the findings, in fact, all of the findings for cancer were post-menopause. But the way they framed it as if it was a lifetime risk, the very first person who filed a lawsuit based on this information, this study, was a 28-year-old Black woman. So they referenced a study because of the way they disseminated it. You had a woman that literally filed the first lawsuit who those studies did not reflect. But if you read inside the study, you see where there was in fact a demarcation line between post-menopause and premenopause. The study literally said that we found so few cases with premenopause, we couldn't establish a risk factor. But because of the way they disseminated it, it made the public think that it was everybody. So when you have people talking about infertility and those type things, they can't reference this study because the study literally said inside that it wasn't about that. So those two together are what we basically are disputing from a Information Quality Act standpoint. Now we're going to go into section 2, is a statement of non-compliance with IOQ standards. So we're going to basically delve into why we feel we have grounds to ask for the information to be corrected in the first place. This is how we're going to basically break down this thing. So we have 4 major areas that we're looking at. The first one was how we found all the other ones initially, and once we found all of them, the actual foundational error finally came to light. And this was just us continuing to dig and dig and dig. And honestly, this is the biggest one and the first question I asked, just from a basic standpoint, which is how can a exposure that's only 4 times a year for 20 minutes be called systemic absorption? That was a basic question I asked. And so it's in the science. So let me go and read this here. Section 2, statement of non-compliance for IOQ standards, methodological gaps and failure of science integrity, regulatory clarification request. Upon review of federal regulatory frameworks, there are no explicit exposure classifications issued by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which has regulatory authority over cosmetics, that apply to rinse off, neutralize cosmetic treatments such as chemical relaxers. This absence has permitted researchers to extrapolate environmental or chronic industrial exposure logic to cosmetic contexts where it does not apply. Let me stop right there. At the end, what we found was that the FDA is who really has jurisdiction over cosmetics. The EPA has jurisdiction over chemicals and industrial stuff. So what we finally found out was that the FDA doesn't have a a standard or a definition for rinse off neutralized treatments. The FDA's cosmetic product safety guidance for industry and the EPA's exposure factors handbook define exposure categories primarily for leave-on, environmental, or chronic contact substances such as lotions, air particles, or other environmental contaminants, but none address short duration or neutralized topical events. Chemical relaxers, being episodic, neutralized, and rinse-off applications fall outside of these chronic contact parameters. Episodic meaning every so often. It's not something that's done often, all the time. It's just every now and then. The closest applicable regulatory category would be acute exposure, meaning a one-time or short-term contact event whose duration and frequency are insufficient to establish sustained systemic absorption. By contrast, subchronic or chronic exposures are defined as repeated or continuous contact over weeks or months. Relaxer applications occurring only a few times per year and immediately rinsed and neutralized fit squarely within this acute or short-term classification, not within a chronic exposure model. The absence of a government federal standard therefore places a heightened duty on federal researchers to apply scientifically consistent toxicological logic. By implying chronic systemic absorption from an acutely applied rinse-off cosmetic event, NIH investigators constructed a biologically implausible exposure scenario inconsistent with any recognized toxicological precedent. This omission does not constitute a formal regulatory violation, but it does represent a failure of scientific integrity and utility under the Federal Information Quality Guidelines. When regulations are silent, agencies remain obligated to uphold the discipline of exposure science itself, anchoring claims in verifiable mechanisms rather than inference. NIH's public dissemination of endocrine disrupting findings in this context therefore fails to meet federal standards of objectivity, integrity, and utility, and has produced widespread public misinformation. Under the FDA's cosmetic product guidance for industry, safety substantiation for cosmetics is not based on chronic systemic toxicology, but on topical use safety criteria. These standards assess localized skin response and recovery following surface application. The FDA framework focuses on three key benchmarks. Number one, irritation and sensitization testing. Evaluates redness, burning, and allergic reaction on the skin surface. Barrier function recovery confirms that skin integrity naturally restores between applications, preventing cumulative absorption. Localized toxicology thresholds establishes tolerance limits for dose per application at the epidermal level. Collectively, these criteria ensure that rinse-off or neutralized cosmetic treatments, such as hair relaxers, are evaluated for episodic topical safety, not continuous systemic exposure. This topical model contrasts with the EPA's exposure framework, which classifies contact by duration and frequency. The difference underscores why cross-applying environmental toxicology standards with cosmetic contexts results in methodological distortion. Now this is interesting here, because when I found this, it just blew me away. I just sat back and said, well, that was the most obvious question that I had. I mean, how would you classify a relaxer that's put on every 8 to 12 weeks and say that caused systemic absorption? And then here we are, after all this studying and researching, we came right back to the answer. It was finally revealed to us. According to the Environmental Protection Service, the EPA, Exposure Factors Handbook and related toxicology guidance exposures are generally classified into three broad categories. Number one, acute exposure, a single or short-term event, usually lasting from 1 to several days. Acute studies evaluate immediate or short-term duration effects and assume no cumulative absorption beyond the initial contact period. Number two, subchronic exposure, repeated or continuous exposure over an intermediate duration, typically 30 to 90 days. This model assesses systemic effects from sustained but not lifetime contact, such as daily occupational or environmental encounters lasting several weeks or months. Chronic exposure, long-term, repeated exposure extending over a year or more, often encompassing the lifespan of the test subject. Chronic classifications apply when chemical contact is continuous enough to model cumulative toxicology or endocrine disruption. Within this dual regulatory landscape, cosmetics are governed by topical safety performance rather than environmental exposure duration, which is why hair relaxers as intermittent neutralized treatments cannot meet the criteria for chronic or subchronic classification under any federal toxicology standard. At most, such events would be characterized as acute or short-term topical exposures, which by toxicology definition are not expected to result in systemic accumulation of endocrine modulating activity. This definitional gap underscores the need for regulatory clarification by the FDA and the EPA to distinguish between leave-on cosmetic exposures and rinse-off or neutralized treatments. Until such treatments exist, NIH and other public health agencies must avoid inputting chronic exposure outcomes to acute or neutralized products and represent these distinctions accurately in all public communications. Started out with a bang. We found it last, but I had to lead with that one because when I saw that, it just blew me away. You'll find out in some of my further exhibits that the EU actually has a standard for rinse-off conditions and rinse-off events in their public dissemination and their regulations. The next one was the one that was also very, very obvious, and I'm like, I don't know how they missed this one, how they got away with it. This one was misrepresentation and misclassification of exposure categories. NIH fundamentally misrepresented exposures by collapsing distinct modalities into a single catch-all category of hair straighteners. This category conflated chemical relaxers, lye and no-lye formulations designed for permanent hair texture change, keratin/Brazilian thermal treatments, which release formaldehyde gas under heat, and non-chemical pressing tools such as flat irons and pressing combs. By combining these very different exposures, NIH created a misleading umbrella that both misclassified exposures and obscured causation. This misclassification was not a minor oversight. It ignored the historical and cultural specificity of relaxers as a distinct product category, long recognized in both scientific research and professional practice. Indeed, prior NIH-related research, including early Black woman study analysis, treated relaxers separately from keratin treatments and from non-chemical heat-based pressing, with several of these epidemiology studies finding either null or low associations with relaxer only. By unilaterally redefining these exposures under the term straighteners, NIH not only departed from its own precedent, but it also erased over 100 years of cultural norms in which these categories were clearly distinguished within the Black community and professional cosmetology. This reclassification directly triggered the study's own disclaimer, buried mid-paragraph with no bold print at the bottom of page 7 of the study, which admitted that combining chemical relaxers, keratin treatments, and non-chemical pressing tools could obscure associations. Yet the NIH omitted this critical caveat from its press materials, effectively hiding the warning from public view. The disclaimer acknowledged the weakness of exposure grouping, but NIH's dissemination chose to highlight dramatic risk figures instead of contextualizing them with the study's own limitations. This reclassification and concealment set off a chain of errors. It allowed NIH to launder miscite toxicology references, to repeat speculative claims about carcinogens and endocrine disruptors, and to apply hazard ratios in ways that falsely implicated chemical relaxers. Misrepresentation of the exposure classification level is therefore the foundational flaw that cascaded into miscitation, misleading communications, buried disclaimers, and widespread litigation risk. This was the one that when I saw this, and it was frustrating because, our sisters, they're concerned about this claim. I know that. And to have them put a flat iron in a questionnaire, it's not even a chemical. A flat iron is not a chemical, but they put it in there and call it chemical relaxers. The government shouldn't have done that. That was just wrong. And so thankfully, we're able to call them out. Now, one of the things all the earlier epidemiology studies would always say at the end, more testing is needed. We did not test any particular product. We didn't test any brands. So there were, because these epidemiology studies are not toxicology reports, and that's to understand, you got to understand that distinction between those two, right? So we're screaming as an industry, hey, test the products. Test them, because we know that these things you're saying aren't in those products. And if they are, it's going to be a trace amount, because there's no need to use preservatives and relaxers because of the pH level. But we'll get into that later. The Myers 2015 study found no detections as ND in HP1 relaxer of endocrine disrupting chemicals. In fact, it was the only hair product tested with ND, yet NIH miscited this toxicology study, exonerating relaxers as containing them. Let me say that again. This toxicology report actually tested relaxers and hair products, and the only one that came back ND for either positive or negative endocrine disrupting chemicals was the relaxer. It was right there. But they cited this study as proof that it had it in it. The other one was the Helm study. The Helm study tested relaxer kits. 2 of the 3 kits showed 0 detections in the liquid activator and the cream. Only 1 showed a trace only in the liquid activator and the cream. Shampoos, conditioners, and the kit contained all those detections, which we understand because shampoos and conditioners are water-based. They're going to have more preservatives because of the water-based. They're going to have more fragrance because we're trying to rinse off the chemical smell of the relaxers. The relaxers, they'll do a job. Rearrange the hair, break the bonds down, take it off. Everything else is designed to neutralize and leave a pleasant smell. Nevertheless, NIH cited as evidence against relaxers. Formaldehyde sources were miscited. Brazilian keratin studies and a German toxicology review apply only to keratin treatments, not relaxers. NIH's news release nevertheless claimed hair straighteners have been known to contain formaldehyde. Selective framing of hazard ratios. The NIH October 17th news release highlighted that frequent users of hair straighteners more than doubled the risk of uterine cancer. That doubling came from the base model in their study, which excluded adjustment for body mass index, BMI, and physical activity. Yet obesity prevalence is the highest among uterine cancer cases, 78%, and together with low physical activity, 18%, representing the only clear outliers when compared with other characteristics of the overall cohort. Rather than address these scientifically proven confounders, well established from prior studies, the authors chose not to include them in the final model. NIH then amplified the unadjusted model in press materials, concealing the role of obesity in physical activity. This selective framing conceals critical confounding information and undermines objectivity and utility under the IQA standards. Medal misrepresentation. The NIH news release also claimed that hair straighteners contain parabens, bisphenol A metals, and formaldehyde that may act as endocrine disruptors. The reference to metals was based on a single Nigerian, let me say that again, a single Nigerian market survey in which 5 of the 6 relaxer products tested were non-US brands, and only one US product was an obscure over-the-counter kit not representative of professional salon relaxers. That study reported only trace levels of heavy metals and did not classify them as carcinogens or endocrine disruptors. The NIH's dissemination exaggerated its limited foreign market evidence by presenting metals as if they were established hazard in US chemical straighteners. This mischaracterization failed objectivity by overstating the evidence base and failed utility by misleading stakeholders who rely on NIH communications for accurate public information. It's incredible. They literally took a Nigerian study with 5 kits that were not even regulated by any US regulations, and they used that as a citation for metals. So this brings us to the 4 main issues that we are talking about. NIH compromised objectivity by ignoring over 100 years of cultural norms by unilaterally merge distinct product categories, chemical relaxers, keratin, formaldehyde smoothing systems, and thermal styling tools into a single hair straightener exposure class. This conflation disregarded fundamental chemical and exposure differences, applying environmental toxicology logic to neutralize cosmetic products and producing conclusions unsupported by toxicology evidence or regulatory precedent. Utility. The resulting communications failed the test of public utility by emphasizing relative risk, 4% lifetime by age 70, while excluding key confounding factors such as BMI, physical activity, and usage frequency. NIH's generated public concern without offering proportionate or actionable health guidance. This misrepresentation of risk undermined informed decision-making among consumers and policymakers. Integrity. Scientific integrity was compromised by selective emphasis on hazard language, formaldehyde, endocrine disruptors, and metals, drawn from unrelated environmental or non-US cosmetic studies. This selective framing extended beyond the data's evidentiary limits, introducing avoidable biases and violating federal principles of transparency, reproducibility, I'm getting tongue-tied, reproducibility, that's the word, and restraint in public dissemination of scientific information. I'm kind of proud of myself. I got almost to page 7 of 10 before getting tongue-tied. The last one, authority misrepresentation. By featuring Miss Dr. Alexandra White both as NIH researcher and study co-author as spokesman for these findings, NIH blurred the line between an external authorized journal article and an official government-endorsed study. This dual representation lent undue authority and primarily epidemiological associations, embedding unverified claims into media narratives and ongoing multi-district litigation. those are the major areas that we are confronting. The final section is basically section 3, which is recommended corrections. Let's talk about it, right? So based on what we found that they misrepresented, what are we asking for as redress as a industry, as citizens, as stakeholders in this whole thing? Number 1, retract or correct miscited evidence. NIH must retract reliance on Myers ND findings, which is not detectable findings, Helms, minimal detections confined to kit shampoo conditioners, and miscited formaldehyde studies, Brazilian keratin and German reviews. Acknowledge these do not show carcinogenic or endocrine disrupting content in relaxers. Number 2, clarify exposure categories. NIH must state explicitly that the JNCI article group relaxers, keratin thermal treatments, and non-chemical pressing flat tools. Historically, relaxers were treated separately in NIH-related research. NIH should restore this clarity to maintain consistency. Contextualize risk statistics. Number 3, NIH must explain that the 4% lifetime risk by 70 is a cumulative group figure, not specific to relaxers, and that premenopausal risk was not estimable. NIH must also disclose that its handling of BMI and physical activity limited interpretation of hazard ratios. BMI was acknowledged as unstable due to small subgroup sample size, and physical activity was removed from the model for non-scientific reasons. These qualifications are necessary to prevent the unadjusted doubling figure from being presented as definitive risk. And to be clear, the physical activity was removed from the model for non-scientific reasons. Do you know they decided to say that just because women who do their hair may not exercise as much, that's why they decided to take and not use that particular confounder? That's cultural assumption. That's not a scientific reason to not use a scientific confounder that you know has a direct causation effect to those types of cancers. Number 4, reproduce the study disclaimer. They have the disclaimer in the actual study, but it never published it publicly. The JNCI article itself, page 7, mid-paragraph, noted exposures included chemical straighteners, relaxers, and non-chemical pressing product tools, and warned that such grouping would obscure associations. NIH must include this caveat in all disseminations. If you know that the numbers that you produce publicly was probably affected by including non-chemical tools, you owe it to the people and the public to tell them that. You do. Number 5, clarify regulatory exposure frameworks. NIH must align its exposure modeling language with established regulatory frameworks. The Food and Drug Administration evaluates cosmetics, including relaxers, under topical use criteria, emphasizing irritation, sensitization, and barrier integrity, not chronic systemic toxicity. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, by contrast, classifies exposures as acute, subchronic, or chronic for environmental and industrial substances. Relaxers being rinse-off and neutralized cosmetics fit into the FDA's short duration topical use category and do not meet EPA's chronic exposure definitions. NIH should explicitly acknowledge this distinction in all public communications and scientific interpretations to prevent further misclassification of cosmetic exposures as environmental or systemic events. Number 6, disclose staff roles. NIH must clarify when staff quoted in communications are also study authors and emphasize NIH's role as a disseminator, not endorser. Number 7, finally, correct formaldehyde statements. NIH must retract the statement that hair straighteners have been known to contain formaldehyde, clarifying instead that the FDA identifies keratin thermal treatments, not relaxers, as relevant exposure. Section 4 is our grounds for petition. Standing as affected manufacturer. As a cosmetic chemist and manufacturer of professional hair products, I am directly harmed by NIH's dissemination. The NIH release and web article branded as NIH communications and featuring NIH staff are repeatedly cited in litigation as proof that these relaxers cause cancer. This framing causes economic harm, lost sales, settlement risk, liability insurance increase or cancellation, reputational harm, stigmatization of professional cosmetics and cosmetologists and brands, and cultural harm, racial bias reinforced through misrepresented science, disclosing the actual findings of toxicology results, as well as accurate separation of exposure types, public acknowledgement of disclaimers, and the role staff disclosures are critical to protect scientific integrity and industry trust. That is our petition. As you see, the final page, 2 pages are my contact information, as well as the submission method timeline. It says who we send this. This petition is submitted in writing via U.S. mail, which it went out today, this morning, officially, to the NIH Information Quality Officer. And in accordance to the NIH guidelines, they have 60 days for a written explanation if additional time is required. And these are all the references that we have included in our study. So we want to start out with that first to say, what are we doing officially? There's going to be obviously a discussion about the cultural, biological, and the scientific underpinnings that resulted in this official petition to the government. And we'll be talking about those later. Again, it's been a pretty long initial session, but we wanted to get that out first. Hopefully you guys will, I look forward to our question and answer period in the evening. And we're gonna continue to push through and just put the truth out there. That's the most important thing. And I don't wanna give it away because I think each day you will be surprised and very proud of our team. They did a lot of hard work, a lot of research was done, and I carried all this knowledge in my head for years. A lot of sleepless nights, a lot of times I was frustrated because I knew the information was being misled, was being misinterpreted, and sometimes outright, misinformation. So I look forward to talking to you guys. Have a good day, and we'll see you soon.